topic of tonight's seminar is dealing with the crazy at Craig. And I wanted to kick this off with just some statistics that were pretty surprising to me when I looked at the numbers. So there's a site called OpsNet, and the tower controller manager here at Craig, well, he retired, he's no longer at Craig, but he gave me this website years ago for like tracking stats on, you can do it for any airport, it's not just for Craig, it's an FAA database, but it's pretty neat if you want to go on there and check it out. It's called OpsNet, and I've got the link here. I'll put this in the YouTube video and if I turn this into a blog. But in any case, you can look up statistics on activities at various airports throughout the country. And just comparing Craig to Jax International, which is the primary airport in the Jacksonville area, right, where you take your airline flights out of. So this data was just since January of this year, average daily operations at Craig versus Jax International, so by day of the week. And then grouped on weekdays total versus just weekends. So on any average weekday, Craig averages 604 operations a day, and Jax International 296, double. On the weekends, a little less than double, but pretty close, 419 and 226. And the peak day seems to be on Thursdays. So, you know, we've kind of sensed that for a while, but when you look at the numbers, it really brings it to reality, just how busy this airport has gotten. And if you track the numbers, I looked up from 2014 through the end of 2023, so for a cumulative 10-year period. In 2014, Craig total operations, and that's takeoffs and landings. Okay, would each kind of, if you had a little clicker tick mark, right, each one would count for one. Total operations, a little over 108,000 in 2014, and it just kept streaming up from there unabated to 2023, 188,055. Do the math, over the last 10 years, that's a 72% increase in traffic, which is just nuts. And we felt that. Our customers have felt that. When we started this business here at Craig in 2013, we had one airplane at the time. It was just my husband and I, and then a year or two later we hired an instructor, and now here we are with this, office suite and 7 airplanes. So it feels busier, I guess, to us cumulatively because we've got a lot more airplanes, a lot more people moving, through during the day. But on an individual basis, everybody has felt it. All of the customers have felt it. The instructors have felt it. There's really just no way getting around it. These two photos here were taken pretty recently. This one I took, I want to say maybe 3-4 months ago, and that was on short final 214. So I'm sitting in the right seat, just with my camera out the window, because I saw as we were on final approach just this blob of airplanes stacked up, and you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, just sitting there. And it's hard to see in the second photo. One of our instructors, Cameron, took this after he had landed, so it looks like he's on Alpha 5, and here's Alpha. He counted, including that jet and a couple others over here, almost 20 airplanes waiting to take off. That's a crazy number of airplanes for, what should be a neighborhood airport, right? So it is what it is, but I was telling some potential customers this morning, and I always preface my new customer orientations or, new customer consults, people that are considering training out of Craig. I'm like, look, you just have to know going into it, there's some downsides, but there's also some positives to this experience, but it is what it is. It's like learning to drive in Manhattan, right? You get what you get, right? It's just a lot of crazy. But it's just something that you have to factor in. This is why I think it's taking people a lot longer to solo. It's taking people a lot longer to get their private pilot certificate. in the whole area, and not just at Craig. I mean, I'm confident that this is affecting everybody at all the airports. The DPEs are backed up now, anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks or longer, depending on the check ride that you're planning on taking. And this is all reflective just of the volume of humanity that has descended upon Florida and upon Jacksonville. You know, anybody who flies around here, you look down over the last 5 years, 6 years in particular, and you just see the neighborhoods expanding. It's almost like watching a cumulonimbus cloud just sort of grow before your eyes, right? You can literally see this town grow before your eyes. The Amazon distribution facility here on the departure end of runway 14, just to the west of the departure end of 14, we've watched that thing mushroom. I don't think that the issues that we're dealing with here at Craig are particularly unique, but they are real, and it's something that we have to just come to terms with. It's not gonna slow down anytime soon, I don't think. So we all have to just find a way to cope with it. Now, my background, I learned to fly in the Washington, D.C. metro area at a little airport called Gaithersburg, Maryland, Golf Alpha, India. It's just north of Washington, D.C., kind of halfway between Baltimore and the D.C. airports. This was in 2001 is when I first started my flight training. That whole metro area had just experienced the .com boom, right? Not too long before. So kind of the DC area, Northern Virginia, all of those suburbs had just dealt with kind of what we're dealing with in Jacksonville now, where just a ton of people moving there, businesses expanding all over the place, real estate construction going, you know, gangbusters, and it was just lots of humanity, lots of airplanes. And I remember when, 9/11 happened and we had all the flight restrictions, thrust upon us in short order. It was like, this is what the taxiway looked like at our non-towered airport, except there was a bunch of people lined up, all with their cell phones, trying to get clearance, just to take off, because that was what we had to do back then. So dealing with this at Craig, for me personally, is annoying, but it's not a game changer for me. Like, I'm kind of used to dealing with this just because of my personal background. But I can appreciate that folks that maybe have not had that experience or brand new to aviation, just like student pilots that were in my shoes back then in the DC area dealing with all that, may have had a little bit of a harder time. I had another advantage. My dad here is a pilot, has been since I was wee high, exposed me to the aviation terminology, to talking on the radio in the New York metro area. So kind of dealing with all that for me personally was, I think I had an advantage there, just having grown up in that environment and the area in which I did most of my primary training. But again, for someone who's relatively new to aviation, I can see how this would, dealing with this stuff could be a big challenge, especially if you've got other things going on, work challenges, or you're just struggling with the stick and rudder, and now you've got this, layered on top of it. It can be a lot. So just a couple little more stats, and then we'll kind of go around the room. And I want this to be not just me lecturing. I really want us, like I said in the email, to have a conversation about this. I want you guys to feel comfortable just being like, hey, this has really been bugging me. And let's collectively try and figure out if there's something that we can help each other sort it out. Hey, Joe. All right. So average daily operations at Craig, Monday through Friday, about 600. So if you do the math during the operating hours that the tower is open, that's about 35 takeoffs and landings per hour, or about, 1 every 2 minutes or so. The peak volume at Craig year to date, and I don't remember this day off the top of my head or if I was even here, but it occurred so far. It was on March 20th with a total of 1,075 operations, or 63 per hour, about 1 a minute. Think about that. Every minute there's a plane taking off and landing all day long. Does anybody have an idea? I didn't even look at the calendar. Was that like a golf tournament or something? Was there anything happening that day? Just everybody got in the mood to fly? Hey, Surprise, we took over your office. Sorry.
No worries.
So anybody who was flying that day obviously had their hands full. And I already mentioned one of our instructors in that photo I showed up top saw almost 20 aircraft holding for departure after he landed, and that was taken this week on Wednesday. Yeah, so yesterday morning. So here are some of the problems, the issues that, and then this is just my short list. Hopefully as we get warmed up here, maybe we'll come up with more things to add to the list, and I can just pop them in, okay, as well as the solutions. So extensive ground delays possible due to the volume of arrivals and departures. And we've personally experienced 10 to 30 minutes or more. It may have been on that 1,000 operation day, I don't remember, but we had 2 pilots left the ramp here in an airplane, intending to go fly, taxied out. I think this was the day they were using runway 5, made it all the way down Bravo, got stuck, because are you all familiar generally with the lay of the airport here? And if you're not, just raise your hand and I can pull up an airport diagram. So, we've got 2 runways, 2 taxiways in pretty much an L configuration. We can only go one way. Taxiways are one way, right? It's not like I-95 where we got 2 directions. So if everybody's got to get one way, people that are trying to come back the other way are stuck if there's people piled up on the taxiway, and it's exactly what happened. So there were like 15 aircraft that were piled up on Bravo trying to depart on runway 5. Some of them in the run-up area, some of them just on the taxiway. And one of our pilots made it all the way down there. After 30 minutes, still sitting and waiting, he was like, forget this, man. I'm just going to turn around, and then tried to turn around and come back and got stuck. Had to wait, again, for people coming. I mean, that was just an absurd sort of day. But the fact that it happened at all is telling to kind of where we are as an airport, what the operations are like here. So we want to try and be proactive and anticipate. And a lot of times there's nothing you can do, right? Just like if you're trying to drive to work or you're trying to drive to school or drive home from wherever, and there's an accident on the Dames Point Bridge and you got to cross it. Well, unless you were, if you were lucky enough to get off at Heckscher and you can take the ferry, right, consider yourself lucky. But if you just got stuck, what are you going to do, right? You just have to sit there. There's literally nothing that you can do. And that's just the way it goes sometimes. That's kind of the price of doing business. That's the cost of doing business around here these days, unfortunately. Crowded ramps, taxiways, and run-up areas limit options for pilots. And we're going to talk about some ways to mitigate that, okay, through strategic planning and communication with the controllers. And I'll pull up an airport diagram here in a moment, and we'll dive into that a little bit. But that is definitely an issue. The Mayport TFR. So not only do we have all kinds of humans and all kinds of crazy, but now we've got this TFR, temporary flight restriction. We've seen this before, right? They need a new category called PFR, permanent flight restriction, which is really what it is, right? Or indefinite. Well, I guess that wouldn't make sense because that would be IFR and that would be confusing. So we'll stick with the P, permanent. But basically this thing is active now weekdays when Mayport class Delta is active. So on the weekends you get a little bit of a break. But Monday through Friday, prime time business hours, even if that thing isn't flying, the TFR is active. And that creates a particular issue for student pilots and others operating within our class Delta, because there's this tiny little cutout on the northeast side of the runway complex with a floor at 1,200 feet. So now you've got this little, you're at 1,000 feet basically in the pattern, and then you've got this thing that starts at 1,200. So if you are not minding your altitude, guess what? And this is why the controllers get antsy. This is why everybody's stress level goes up 10 notches, right? When there's pattern work going on Monday through Friday because of this. There's not a dang thing we can do about it, right? I guess you could write your congressperson, raise hell to whoever you want, but this thing is here to stay, at least for now. Good call not flying, by the way. Somebody mentioned this already, but increased workload on the controllers due to the traffic volume and the higher stress levels associated with that, and the possibility of human error. And that's one thing we're going to talk about in terms of what we can do to mitigate and deal. Is you got to remember, they are human beings. They are not robots. At least right now, this is not AI air traffic control, right? Those are people up there, just like you. No better. On a good day, could be worse, right? But they're just people. And you got to respect that fact and always remember that. And, some of you may have heard the commonly used little phrase, trust but verify, right? Yes, they are paid professionals that have a job to do. I could not do their job. I mean, I could try. I would probably be horrible at it. I mean, that's a very, very stressful job to be an air traffic controller. I have lots of respect for those guys. But at the same time, again, they are subject to stress and mistakes just like we are. They make mistakes. I've called them out on plenty of mistakes, not because I'm, mad at them or anything, but if they make a mistake, you got to let them know. You can't just be like, okay, and whatever they say and just do it if you know that's going to cause a mid-air collision, right? Or that's going to take you somewhere where you shouldn't be. You always have to know. You have to have that little background process running in your mind to check them, right? To make sure that they are doing their job. Because if they don't do their job, you could get hurt, right? They're not the one in the airplane, you are. So always, never ever forget your responsibility as PIC that, yes, you're supposed to follow their directions inside controlled airspace, but you as the PIC always have the authority to say, no, unable. What are you talking about, right? If something doesn't make sense or if you realize that a mistake has been made. And that again dovetails with the next thing, increased workload for pilots due to the traffic volume, the Mayport TFR. Pilots get stressed, and we make mistakes when we're stressed, right? This is just part of, again, being human. We talk about human factors in aviation. Well, we got human factors all over the place right now going on dealing with this, right? We're going to talk about situational awareness. Everybody know what I mean by situational awareness, right? You have to be really sharp on your radio communication skills. There's just no way around it. Talking back about when I was training up in the DC area, my first 3 weeks of flight training were before 9/11 happened. And so at the time, it was still, we were outside of the DC Baltimore class Bravo. We're at this little non-towered field. Basically, pretend it's Fernandina Beach or Hurlong. Okay, that was where I started out. And then everything changed. And now you got to call for clearance. You got to have a squawk code just to fly in the pattern or to go anywhere. And if you don't, there's this threat that a, F-15 is going to, be up your butt in 30 seconds. And, that was creating a lot of stress for people. But you had to have good navigation skills. You had to know where the edge of the airspace was. Just like now, you got to know where the edge of the Mayport TFR is. You have to. And if you don't, I'm not letting you fly, period, right? You got to know how to talk to the controllers. If you don't know how to do that, I'm not going to let you fly, period. You just have to know how to do it, because otherwise you're going to get in deep duty or impact somebody, literally, right? So it's just the stakes are much higher for everybody. And what happens when people get overloaded and stressed? Sometimes things suffer, right? There's only so many plates that the waitress can carry before, the dinner falls in everybody's lap, right? There's only so much that people can handle. Now with practice, right? Like when you're a new student pilot, you can just handle one little thing and that's it. And you're lucky if you can handle that one little thing. And good on you for handling that one little thing on day one, right? But it's building blocks, right? Okay, now we hand you another thing and another thing. It's like a juggler, right? 2 balls, 3, 4, and eventually you've got this, carnival trick where the guy's got, 20 plates in the air. That's how we feel sometimes, right? And like we're juggling 20 plates in the air. So how do we prioritize all of that workload, right? And how do we not allow basic aircraft control to suffer when we got 3 people yapping in the headset and altimeter showing 1,100 feet on the downwind for 1-4 and all of these things, right? And it's hot. So we'll see if we can come up with some ways to help mitigate some of those things. This is something that me and a couple of the instructors were talking about this morning, is pilots over-relying on ADS-B. Does anybody not know what ADS-B is? Just raise your hand. It's okay if you don't. I'll explain. Everybody pretty confident know what ADS-B is, right? So pilots over-relying on this and the GPS inside the Class Delta airspace. You can't be staring at your iPad in the traffic pattern, guys. And that goes for you Hurlong folks too. I don't care where you're at. You can't be staring at the iPad on the downwind to the traffic pattern or entering the pattern. You got to have those eyeballs looking out the window, because that's where the stuff is that's going to kill you. A flock of geese is not going to show up on your iPad. A Piper Cub without a transponder is not going to show up on your iPad. I mean, or a glider, right? So there's lots of things out there, or a skydiver, right? We got those around here too. So you absolutely have to look out the window. We see this all the time. And I know it's tempting, and it's a double-edged sword, right? I'm the first one to say and advocate, use this technology for what it's good for, and use it to your advantage, right? It's like light them if you got them, right? If you're not using the tools that you have, you're not doing yourself any favors, but you also can't, again, prioritize that at the expense of other things, right? You have to learn to manage it. You know, I've heard of instructors that say, well, we're just not going to let anybody use their iPad until after solo, or we don't let them use their iPad. Like, well, to me, that's kind of silly. Do you know what I mean? Are we adults? Like, you have to learn some self-control and understand, okay, this is a tool available for this purpose, and this is why you use it, right? It's not like telling a kid, don't touch the cookie jar, right? Stay out of the cookie jar. I mean, come on, right? We're pilots. We should be able to sort of have some self-discipline and use the tools appropriately, right? So, so the last sort of problem I'll say that relates to that is I do believe there is a much higher probability these days of a mid-air collision happening somewhere within this Class Delta airspace. I don't think it's if, I think it's when. It's gonna happen. And I don't want it to be any of you guys, and I certainly don't want it to be me, right? And looking out the window, I will tell you, has saved my ass from about half a dozen mid-air collisions, where if I hadn't looked out the window, I would have gotten whacked. And I'll tell you where it's happened the most. Departing runway 23 here at Craig, and you're often making right-hand traffic here. I mean, the controller could tell you to make left-hand traffic, but you're often turning right, which would mean on your crosswind you're heading toward downtown to the west. So here I am in my Cessna 150 departing runway 23, climbing out, guy in, let's just call it a Cirrus, a Bonanza, twin Cessna, something faster than me in my Cessna 150, which is pretty much anything except for my Cub, departing IFR, and they get the following clearance. On departure, climb and maintain 3000, turn right heading 280. Reference that Cessna 150 that just departed ahead of you. Turn behind them. So the instruction there is for, here I am, is for the faster airplane to wait for me to turn crosswind first. Now, meanwhile, they're gaining up on me, right? So they need to do what they need to do. I will turn my crosswind early, and this is part of the situational awareness for you folks that are in the 150, to not get run over. You got to know who's behind you, right? Just like when you're driving, right? Hopefully you're looking in the rearview mirror, and you know that double FedEx semi is coming at you at 80 miles an hour, so you don't want to hit the brakes, and get whacked, right? So this faster airplane is supposed to turn around me, behind me, right? But they don't. Gear up. As soon as they're past the departure into the runway, zing, make that right turn to 280, forgetting about the little 150. And guess what? Right? that has happened, I'm not joking, at least half a dozen times, where if I hadn't lifted my right wing and looked, I would have slammed right into the guy. And it happens all the time. And that's just one example, right? And that's why we are so big at this flight school on telling people you got to clear your turns. You know, we see people, they're flying along and they're like, clear right. What is that, right? You looked at something on your shoulder, right? You're not looking out the window. You got to really look at that blind spot. It's like in your car. Would you ever change lanes? Hope not, right? Without checking your blind spot. That's a really good way to get killed on the interstate, right? So these seem like should be trivial things, but we see people getting complacent about this all the time. And you just can't let yourself do that. So that's my short list of issues. Anybody else have an issue that maybe is related to this but different? Come on. Don't make me talk all night long.
Developing a good crosswind takeoff and landing gives you options to sometimes ask the controller for a different runway than they're using.
Yes.
If it suits your purposes.
Absolutely, and I think I've got that in the solutions. Yep, that's a good one. I've got that in the solutions or suggestions, absolutely. And when we're done here, I'm gonna pull up an airport diagram so we can kind of do a little play-by-play of all these things, absolutely. But any other problems? So are you saying a problem could be I'm not confident with my crosswind takeoffs, and so that limits me?
I've got to stay with the crowd then.
Correct, right. So I'll add that as a problem, lack of confidence and or skill with crosswind, not crossword puzzles, crosswind takeoffs and landings, limiting runway options. Yes? Okay, that's great. Anybody else? Dad?
I know we've talked about this before. It just drives me nuts. Is how wide the traffic pattern is, which totally.
But that's a great point, Dad. Thanks for bringing that up, right? And so this gets that ties directly into something that the AIM references. Everybody know what the AIM is? The Aeronautical Information Manual, sort of the advisory section of the FAR AIM, with some pretty good suggestions in there on a bunch of stuff. They talk about unusual maneuvers in the traffic pattern, right? How this is a problem. This could create a collision hazard if you're doing something unexpected, right? And it could be something as blatantly unexpected, like you're supposed to make right traffic on this runway for, let's say there's an on-towered field that has right traffic published for a particular runway for whatever reason. And you don't read the note, and you just assume it's left, and you start making left traffic. That would be something unexpected. Other pilots are expecting you to go right, and you just turn left because you didn't read them, you didn't get the memo, and everybody's like, what the heck is this guy doing, right? Not being at the correct altitude. Joining the traffic pattern, this is one of my pet peeves. People saying, I'm 4.7 miles out on the 45 to the runway, whatever the runway is. Okay, so 4.7. Obviously, I know they're staring at the GPS, otherwise how do they know they're exactly 4.7 miles from the airport, right? On the 45 is kind of like what the cool kids say when they're joining the traffic pattern, but at least half the time, people aren't actually making a 45-degree angle entry. They're like here, they're kind of somewhere on this side of the airport, but they're not actually at a 45-degree angle. So you're looking for somebody legit on this 45-degree angle, and they're like, where is this person, right? That's doing something unexpected, that's creating a hazard. So the best thing that we can do is just be accurate, right? Do your best to be accurate, and don't say stuff just to say stuff. Don't say you're on the 45 when you're not, right? Good point about the traffic pattern excesses. Anything else? Come on, don't make me do all the talking.
This is one that happened to me the other day, and I think that the controller got a little peeved. And so what what had happened was they called their typical call, left midfield, downwind, and it was 1-4 was active.
Yeah, and you know, if it gets to that point where, you know, they ask you to report midfield, which is just that's the standard request, right? And do you know why they ask you? Does anybody know why do they typically ask you to report midfield? I mean, he's looking out the window, right? Why do they ask you to report midfield? Why do they bother doing that?
Remind him just in case he's lost track of you.
Yeah, it's for their benefit, right? Because they're not. Now, Craig does have a radar feed off of Jax, but not all towers do. And just like I don't want the pilot staring at the iPad, the controller can't be staring at the screen. He's not a radar controller. He's a local controller working local traffic at this airport, right? So they're looking out the window also. I mean, obviously they're using the radar image, you know, a fair amount, but they can't issue radar vectors. They're looking out the window at the traffic just like you are. So yeah, there are going to be times when they ask you to report midfield, but there's 3 people and then you got a King Air coming in on the ILS and blah, 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 and all of these things, right? So you're just expected to keep following the conga line on the downwind, right? And usually in that situation, they will preempt any call that you might make, and they may say, for example, you know, you were supposed to call midfield, but blah, 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 blah is going on, and so you're trucking along on the downwind. And then eventually, you may hear a call. I'll just use one of our call signs. 65842, you're looking for traffic is a King Air on a 3-mile final. So, okay, looking for traffic, right? Or traffic not in sight, or traffic in sight, right? And then you'll get that landing clearance. Sometimes that's just the way it goes. And to take this to the extreme example, right, when you're doing an arrival to an air show like Sun and Fun or Oshkosh, the NOTAM, the directions for the arrival, the VFR arrival procedure specifically says, do not communicate with the tower unless it's an emergency. Don't say anything. We will talk to you, and we don't want you to respond verbally at all. Because can you imagine, right? There's 200 airplanes in the air all following one another to an airport. If like everybody starts talking at the same time, it would be total chaos. They usually tell you to turn your transponder off too. Because if they're trying to pick out an IFR target or somebody who they legit need to follow on radar, it would just get lost, right? It's the proverbial needle in a haystack, right? They would never be able to find that person effectively. So sometimes that happens, but it sounds like you did the right thing. All right, any other issues?
Sometimes if you miss the midfield, could you come to the end and tell them you're turning rather than trying to get back to midfield? So.
No, you can't just turn because they could have people, they have to clear you to land before you can turn the base because you could be cutting somebody off. Because a lot of times they'll be feeding people in from both sides of the runway. So they could have you on the left downwind and 2 other people on the right downwind and 3 guys lined up on final. And they're just sort of popping people in, right? So you can't just willy-nilly turn. You have to wait for them to tell you.
Tell them that, or they should tell you, or you tell them I'm turning left on final.
No, you don't say I'm turning. If you start turning before they tell you, that could be a huge problem.
I would never turn before I told them, but you've missed your midpoint signal.
Right.
So when would be the next time, I guess, is a better question.
So like,
tell them.
yeah, so like what I was just telling Joe in his example when he got extended, right, on the downwind and couldn't make the midfield call and ended up, let's say, a half a mile or a mile further out on the downwind, parallel to the final, right? If they don't preemptively contact you, then you would just say on the extended downwind or abeam the numbers or on the downwind following the Archer or, traffic in sight. It will rarely get to that point because if you've gotten that far down the pike because you couldn't contact them, they will contact you. And if for some reason they didn't, you're thinking to yourself, oh, again, human errors. Did they forget about me? they're talking to those other people on the other side. What about me? If you can get a word in edgewise, then I would definitely say 842, you know, extend it on the downwind. I have the Cirrus in sight. Sort of like a, hey, remember me? Right? Oh, yeah. Right? Or they may say, yeah, continue flying on the downwind. Okay, continue flying on the downwind. You know, flying the pattern for, you know, runway 32, I mean, sometimes you end up over, you know, Mayo Clinic before you're turning base, right? That's way the heck out on Butler. It's like a 4 or 5 mile, you know, extension on the downwind sometimes. Welcome to Crazy Town. Any other issues?
Well, this another one that kind of relates to what you were just saying. They'll often say follow, and then they'll say, too much airtime did I take?
No, you have to clarify in that situation. You don't really have a choice, right? Because the worst thing you want to do is make an assumption,
Yep.
right? Because what if that's not the guy he meant? And I've had this happen, right? Again, controllers make mistakes. Or you just simply don't see the guy. You're looking 2 airplanes ahead when there's one here, or vice versa, right? It happens. So you absolutely have to clarify in that situation. Let's see if we can come up with some solutions, okay? Some of these are obvious, some of them we'll talk about, and I brought a handheld radio here. I don't know with the weather if we're gonna have much to listen to right at the moment, but we'll give it a shot. So the obvious solution, right, is to, if you can, try and fly during non-peak times. Now, I know that's often easier said than done, given everybody's schedules, and say, well, if everybody flies during non-peak times, then that's going to get busy, right? So, but you know, if possible, right, maybe try and shift at least some of your flying during those non-peak times, weekends or weekday evenings. You know, now we're getting into the summer months, so in the evenings, the storms will be over. A lot of people will have gone home. Traffic tends to be a little lighter. You know, me personally anymore, when I want to go fly my Cub, it's at, you know, 6 o'clock on a Sunday night. Nobody around, very few people, right? So if you have the luxury of flexing your schedule, that could be one, you know, obvious option to consider. And the corollary to that obviously is avoid flying during the peak times if possible. You know, there's lots of flight schools in this town. There's 8 here at Craig. So, you know, most of those businesses are open, you know, Monday through Friday, 7 or 8, you know, until 6. You know, ATP has their, you know, big hours. The college program has their hours. You know, obviously people are out here at night doing their night flights when appropriate, but, you know, it's obvious that most of the flying is happening, you know, during the day. So if you feel comfortable and you're able, that could be an option, is to just try and, you know, shift to some of those non-peak times or avoid the peak times if possible. And mornings get busier in the summer for obvious reasons, because that's the sweet spot for weather. You know, it's rare that I have a 7 a.m. slot open, you know, more than, you know, less than 2 weeks out between now and September, just because that's the popular time to fly, just because it's the most comfortable, least weather problems. I want to talk now a little bit about radio communications, because this is an area where I feel a lot of people struggle, and especially new pilots, but even pilots that are, you know, a decent ways down the pipeline. There's lots that you can do to get better at this at home or on your own time at the airport for free. And I'm not sure people are really taking advantage of it or practicing it as much as they should. I'm not seeing the results, I guess, of people maybe practicing it as much as they should. One thing that you can do is get yourself a little handheld radio. I haven't priced these out these days, but I'm pretty confident you can get one for under $200, probably a lot less than that used. We've got a couple that we offer our students to borrow. Some of them have their rechargeable batteries, so you got to make sure that it's charged, but the battery on this one is going out, which is why I turned it off until I was ready to turn it on here. But if you practice listening on the radio and hearing the responses and kind of the play-by-play, it's just like learning a new language, right? Anybody take Spanish in high school or French or some foreign language, right? When you first start it, you're like, it's just weird, right? Nothing makes sense, it's just all. But then eventually you start hearing things in context and it makes a little more sense and you're able to respond correctly to a question, right? ¿Dónde está el baño? Oh, ahí, right? And so you get easier at sort of processing in the other language, right? Without first having to translate. I was just talking to my daughter and her friend, ironically, about this on the way home. We were talking about learning a foreign language, and I said it's kind of like when you first start, you have to see the object, right? Like phone, and think, what is the word for that in whatever language? And you have to think, use your little mental dictionary. Oh, that's the word. And then say it, right? But you're not instinctively looking at the phone and thinking whatever the word is, right? Just like for native English speakers, you don't have to look at the phone and think, what is the word for this thing? Oh, phone, right, it's phone. You just speak it. And so for pilots, I think when you're new, right, there's that little background process going on of, what do I say? What did they say? What does that mean, right? And you kind of have to think about it for a minute and then say something. Versus once you get a little bit more experience and exposure, you can just respond like you're having a conversation with your family or friend over the dinner table on whatever topic, right? It just becomes a bit more natural. But like anything, right, just like your landings, right, the radio communications just take time and practice and some dedication and effort to get it right. I think a lot of people just expect it to happen sort of by osmosis, like, well, if I just hang out in the airplane enough, I'll just be able to figure it out and I'll be okay, right? And there is some of that, right? But you have to practice. Even with all of the experience that I had with my dad, I practiced radio communications. I practiced reading back clearances. I read them to my dog while I was walking the dog. I think I told you that. I would walk my dog around the neighborhood and I would practice reading clearances to him. I didn't care what my neighbors thought, but it worked, right? It helped me a lot. So you have to be willing, I think, to do those things and invest the time, which again doesn't cost you anything. You're not paying an instructor to do that. You're not burning fuel at $6 a gallon to do that. You're just investing your time. Now, hopefully you value your time just like I do, and that's a good investment in time. Joe was alluding to something called ADSB, what is it, stack exchange?
Right.
Yeah, and so for those of you that use ForeFlight, which I think most people do or something similar, if you're on an internet connection at your house or your office or wherever you happen to be, and you just turn on the traffic, all of that same stuff that would show up on ADSB Exchange or SkyVector or whatever will show up on the ForeFlight. And you can just sit there in your living room with your glass of wine or your coffee or whatever, and you can watch the traffic. So if you couple that with radio, you can stalk your friends on ForeFlight and practice the response, right? And you just pick a plane. Just stalk this person around the traffic pattern or wherever they're flying and pay attention to what ATC is saying to them, what they're saying back, and think about, what would I say, right? Or if they say something, be like, oh no, that wasn't quite pro. This is what I would say. And you practice saying it, right? Just like learning a language. I tried very unsuccessfully using Rosetta Stone when I was pregnant with our daughter, trying to learn Russian. Did I tell you that? It was a disaster. I got through, Dad was fluent in it, but I, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12 13 14 15 16 17 18 19 20 21 22 23 24 25 26 27 28 29 30 31 32 33 34 35 36 37 38 39 40 41 42 43 44 45 46 47 48 49 50 51 52 53 54 55 56 57 58 59 60 61 62 63 64 65 66 67 68 69 70 71 72 73 74 75 76 77 78 79 80 81 82 83 84 85 86 87 88 89 90 91 92 93 94 95 96 97 98 99 100 101 102 103 104 105 106 107 108 109 110 111 112 113 114 115 116 117 118 119 120 121 122 123 124 125 126 127 128 129 130 131 132 133 134 135 136 137 138 139 140 141 142 143 144 145 146 147 148 149 150 151 152 153 154 didn't get very far with that because I didn't really invest the time because I was like falling asleep on the couch because I was pregnant, so whatever, cut myself some slack there. But I did try. But this is the same kind of thing, right? Where you can just put in the time, go through the motions, and I think it'll get a little bit easier. So we're riding down the main airport road toward the control tower. And there's a little pavilion at the base of the control tower here, which is a great place to just watch airplanes, listen to traffic, because they've got it broadcast, the tower frequency broadcast over the speakers at the pavilion. So we're gonna go see what's happening today. So here's the control tower, here's the admin building, and we're coming up on the little pavilion where we can sit and watch and listen. So we're just gonna park our bikes and see what's happening in the airport. Now, because it's pretty windy today, I think that may keep the traffic volume down a little bit, but I'm going to show you how you can use traffic on ForeFlight in addition to the ATC audio and what you see in real life to help develop some situational awareness and confidence when dealing with a busy traffic pattern. So there's a nice picnic table here where you can sit and relax in the shade, and I've got my iPhone with my ForeFlight up. Now, I haven't heard any comms on the radio yet. Like I said, traffic is still pretty light, but there's 2 aircraft holding short of the runway right now during their run-up. There's another one landing right now. We'll see if this airplane does a touch and go, and then we'll probably hear their radio transmissions in the pattern. But it's really great to be able to keep track of where everyone is using the traffic display on ForeFlight. I don't know if you can see it in the video there. Kind of hard with the glare outside. In addition to the audio that we would hear from the tower. So let's just wait a moment and see if we hear anybody else chime in. So I heard somebody with the call sign Echo Romeo say that they were on the visual for runway 23. So when someone says they're on the visual, that typically means that they're on an instrument flight plan and they've been cleared for a visual approach. So I'm looking on ForeFlight here to see if I... Oh, here they are. Interesting, they're being vectored right over Mayport. So the TFR is active right now, but there must not be a drone flying, because I don't know if you can see right there. There's Echo Romeo on final for runway 23. And someone was just told to hold short of the runway. So I'm gonna walk over here now and show you what's happening out on the runway. Try and get it over the fence. That's why I brought this little tripod here. So I don't know if you can see right now, there's 3 airplanes holding short of the runway. So 1 aircraft was just cleared for takeoff on runway 23, and you can see them rolling right now. So if you were trying to follow along with the radio communications, you could hear what's being broadcast over the tower frequency up at the pavilion, and you could look at your ForeFlight to see the tail number if you have traffic enabled. So you can kind of start to develop that sense of keeping track of, okay, who just spoke, what type of airplane is that person, what's their call sign, where are they, and what are they doing. So when you're flying, this is going to help you really maintain that, what we call situational awareness of what's going on around you. I've always told my students, especially when you're, working on your instrument rating or dealing with airspace, be obviously respectful of other pilots and the controllers, but be very selfish, because it's all about you. You are the pilot in command, your butt is in that airplane, you're the one burning the gas, you figure out what works best for you, and that's plan A, period, right? You may not always get what you want, right? I think there's a song to that effect, but you can at least try, right? If you don't take the shot, you'll never know if you would have gotten it, right? So you have to, I think, be a bit aggressive when you're flying. I don't mean unsafe. I just mean, don't be shy about opening your mouth and asking for what you want, for thinking outside the box, if it's within the rules. But just because this guy over here isn't doing it doesn't mean you can't. This gets back to the crosswinds, right? Here's Craig, all right? And the tower controllers, to their credit, will often suggest some of these solutions if they're able, okay? But you should be thinking for yourself, okay, this is my plan A to get out of here without a big weight. So for example, if the winds are, I don't know, let's just say, they're splitting the runway. Let's just say it's, 280, winds 280 at 10, and or 290, and most people are taking off and landing on runway 32. That's the active. And you're heading west, you're heading south. Request 23, right? There could be, 5 people in line here, dutifully waiting to take off on 32 because that's what they were told. But you're like, well, it's going to be a crosswind either way. Why don't I just get out of here? It's an extra 10 degrees, right? If you're confident in your crosswind takeoffs, you realize, you do the math, you're like, okay, that's like a couple extra knots. Who cares? And it's going to save me 15 minutes because now I don't have to wait in line behind all these people. It's like if you're at the Walmart or the Sam's Club, right? And there's 20 people in line for I've had this happen the other day actually at the Winn-Dixie. It was hysterical. There was a line for the self-checkout, and there's this one high school kid working aisle number 3 all by himself because nobody's coming to him, and he's sitting there waving, and I happen to notice him. I'm like, that's where I'm going. Like, why am I going to wait in line behind all these other people? I'll go over here to this poor kid who's in aisle number 3 looking for some business. I'm like, you look lonely over here, right? Check me out. Thank you, right? So, you can strategize a little bit, but obviously, if it was a strong crosswind, like let's say the winds were 320 at 10, gusting to 15, okay? And I'll still request, me personally, if there's that situation, I'll still request 2-3, because I'm okay with that crosswind component. But if you're not, as pilot in command, obviously that's a really bad idea if you're not comfortable with that kind of wind. But you can and should be able to get to that level, right? And so if you make that a personal goal, hey, I can buy myself a lot more options and frankly a lot more safety in lots of situations if I up my game, if I up my skill dealing with crosswinds. Not only will I be a safer and more competent pilot, I just opened up a whole nother runway for myself. Now, but if it's a situation where the wind is, moderate like that, they may not suggest it. Yeah. Okay, especially if it's a, because they don't know what the pilot's experience level is, right? And, I actually don't know what their
Yeah.
protocol is to that effect. If they're like, okay, you know, if it's less than 10 knots, you can offer it. If it's more than that, I actually don't even know. That would be a great question for the tower, honestly. But regardless of what their policy is, if I'm okay with it, I'm asking for it. Because why would I sit there and wait, you know, for no reason if I'm okay? And the same with the landing. You know, if it's going to be, if they got, you know, 5 people stacked up in the pattern to land on 3-2, right? And if it's going to be, for me personally, a 10-knot crosswind landing on 5, I'm like, request, you know, 5, I can hold short of 3-2, no problem. Okay. Bonus prize for me, it's closer to the fuel where I got to go anyway after I land. So by me being comfortable with that and upping my skill and being a safer pilot because of it, I also just made a lot more avenues open to myself to handle various situations. So there is a real, not only a safety advantage, but a real strategic advantage to being comfortable with, you know, what should be relatively routine flight operations like a crosswind takeoff or landing. Unfortunately, it was right about here where my GoPro camera died, but we did talk about one more thing before we wrapped up the seminar, and that was how we can effectively use visual landmarks to identify the boundaries of the Mayport TFR. So anybody who flies in this airspace, I would encourage you to look at your sectional chart and perhaps at a Google Map view and try to identify particular landmarks or features of the airport property that you can use to identify the boundaries of the TFR when you're flying. Thank you so much for watching.